Hello, Karibu, and welcome to the Africa Deep Diving YouTube channel and our discussion program, Africa Rising. This week, we continue with the series on the psychology of racism in Africa, and joining me on the village bench once again is Edge. Edge, Karibu.
Asante sana.
How are you
Glad to be
doing?
here with you. I'm very well.
I hope you're looking forward to this topic because we've covered East Africa, we've gone to West Africa,
now we're down
South Africa, the musical chairs of colonialism.
Yes.
And this one will be very interesting because it's going to be like a kaleidoscope of what's the collective noun for a group of colonizers? Is it a conspiracy of colonizers?
I don't know. It's a
An
cacophony
illicitness of imperialists?
We'll come up with a name.
We will.
By the end of the show, we should have a name.
Definitely. So this week we are concentrating on Southern Africa, not just South Africa, because it's a very interesting story. And we'll make sure that we go as deeply as possible to set the platform as to the conditions that led up to apartheid. So this week we are covering the years from 1652 to 1948. That will become more apparent as we go along. Why? But before we dive deep into this topic, let us look at some of the news items of the last week.
Yeah.
So we'll start with the first news item. Oh, by the way, let me just mention that this episode is sponsored by the KIPSIGIS Museum in Karen Village. The KIPSIGIS Museum in Karen Village. So yeah, we'll start off with the news items this week.
Yeah.
The first news item on the agenda is that the US tells Kenya to publicly support Israel or forget a free trade deal. Now, the US insists that Kenya must not tax digital products and not require US firms to store data locally. This is kind of over the top edge. I mean, this is definitely a display of American imperialist soft power.
Yeah.
Because Kenya is one of the most vocal supporters of the state of Israel.
Yeah.
Okay, like official Kenyan policies that we support as Kenya, the two-state solution.
Yeah.
We allow the Palestinians to have a representative office in Nairobi.
Yeah.
But this really is just a display of soft power from American imperialism. Or what do you think?
Yeah, and I'm just wondering, when did things shift so much that, I mean, we've made it more than clear. I mean, I can just think of so many reasons or things that show that Kenya is very much integrated with the state of Israel. You know, if I look at just even the exchanges we have on the agricultural front, on the military front, security front, I seem to remember there was a crisis we had where some buildings were collapsing and we got a lot of help from Israel. So we've always been very friendly, and all of a sudden we're having to say this. It's really kind of what I call kindergarten bullying. It's like, say you're my friend or else.
It is.
You know?
It's kind of demeaning as well, because in terms of trade negotiation, politics and custom, it weakens our position anyway, because when you start adding a third party, although that third party is seen in the international stage to be a very important player, it weakens our negotiating position.
Exactly.
So,
and it's also interesting, I'm not sure what the details are in terms of where Israel will come into this deal, what role they're going to be playing, and why we are all of a sudden being asked to, you know, to kind of say they are our friends. And then the other thing is about data, you know, having American companies store their data outside of Kenya. I'm beginning to ask myself, what happens to the protection of African people's data?
Exactly.
Because in this interaction, what are we really saying? Are we saying that Kenyans should not own their data? Which then brings up a lot of issues as well around things like the Huduma number that we are trying to get. You know, are those servers going to be in Kenya? Who owns that data? What if they decide to switch off that data? Then how do we access systems? How do we access services? So there's a whole conversation there that is also a bit strange around that requirement. Yeah.
Definitely. And Netanyahu was here about 2 or 3 years ago.
Exactly.
And, you know,
officially, because I think he does unofficially come here.
Yes, many of them do.
Yeah.
And you know, they've made a big public showing of the togetherness of the two countries. We've had long historical ties from the days of just after post-independence, maybe even before, who knows.
Yeah.
But we'll see how that story develops. Now, the second news item on the agenda is French bank probed for role in Sudan war crimes. So this is the French bank BNP Paribas, and it's accused of aiding war crimes committed in Sudan's Darfur region. And I like the way I wrote it down here is exactly how it appeared to me. They say French are looking into it, which is such a nebulous term. I mean, what does that mean? Because that is supposed to cover a whole multitude of sins and say, don't worry, we've got this. They're accused of ignoring sanctions against Omar al-Bashir, but this just continues a long history and tradition of banks being involved in wars. I think it was one of the Rothschilds, in fact, the main Rothschild, who stated that, there's no winners, there's no losers for banks.
There's no losers for banks.
Often they supply funds to both sides.
Exactly.
Of the bank,
And so even as the French are looking into it, I think nobody's really talking about how just in their involvement they've funded the deaths of so many people.
Yeah.
And there's no reparations for these people, there is no kind of justice for these guys, and they're going to look into it. I think again, back to this kind of almost a callous, flippant approach to African issues. It's like, so what, a couple of Darfurians died, yes, we funded it, we'll look into it. It's very kind of dismissive.
Yeah.
And again, that really just plays to this whole topic we're covering about the psychology of racism. And this is, by the way, not even the first bank, I'm sure, that was involved.
And it won't
because
be the
if you
last.
think, and it won't be the last. If somebody was selling arms to these guys, how was the money being exchanged? How was it being moved back to the owner or back to the place it needs to go to? It was through banks. So again, let's not kid ourselves. But I think that response of looking into it,
and it infringes on all codes of impartiality because it's a French bank and it's the French authorities that are looking into it. So where's the third party impartiality? Non-existent.
Yeah.
Anyway, so our third and final news item is an update on a story that we've been following and covering for the last few weeks, which is Mali and the coup. And an interim president was sworn into office, a former colonel by the name of Ba Ndao. All my Malian brothers, I hope I've pronounced that correctly, and sisters. If I get into trouble. Ba Ndao is a former colonel. Can't remember how old he is, but he looks like a pretty elderly gentleman. So he's let's be polite and say he's experienced. And the appointment was announced on Monday, and apparently he'll rule for a maximum of 18 months before staging elections. Now the reason I've tried to suppress laughter is because it's such an African thing. Yeah, I'll only be here for 18 months and then I'll hand over power.
Yeah, he'll be a presidential
30 years later. Exactly.
Yeah.
So anyway, maybe cynicism gets the better of me, but I think that's one of those ones where we'll just use the classic line, let's see how this one develops.
Yeah.
Okay, so those are the news items of the week. Once again, a reminder that this episode is sponsored by the KIPSIGIS Museum in Karen Village, which is where we're actually shooting from and locating. So, Edge, Southern Africa.
Southern Africa.
This is a very extensive topic, especially
huge.
when it comes to the psychology of racism in Africa, because Southern Africa is not just South Africa. So we're talking about the country of South Africa itself, we're talking about Angola and Mozambique, the Portuguese colonies, we're talking about Malawi, Zambia, Namibia, Zimbabwe, and Lesotho, Eswatini. I almost said Eswatini.
Botswana.
Yes, Botswana.
Yeah.
So it's the reason it's actually very good and apposite that we do it like this is because all of these countries in many ways are intertwined and interlinked.
Oh yeah.
And we'll get into the reasons why shortly. But Edge, maybe you can start off by maybe setting the platform. Like we said, we're concentrating on the years between 1652 and 1948. But maybe you can set the stage as to maybe what South Africa was like before. Who were the first people who were around? What was happening in Southern Africa at that time?
Certainly. I think it's also good to mention that even as we cover these topics, and I know we've gone really quickly across the entire continent, we still haven't covered North Africa, but I think it's a very important point here that you bring up, which is we are deep diving, but we can only kind of also just do the broad strokes in all these topics. I just encourage the viewers to go and do more research. What we are hoping to do is obviously pique people's interest.
Start a conversation.
Start a conversation and then see what other areas you'd like to deep dive into. But it's really just creating those broad brush strokes as we then just look at how and where we are in terms of the psychology of racism today and the background that actually created that. So if you look at South Africa specifically, In fact, the first, I guess, European colony was set up in 1652. But that's not to say that there wasn't any kind of European contact before. You'd had the Portuguese trading around that area for some time with the local communities, and obviously bypassing those areas as they went off to discover the Far East. So there was some sort of interaction that was happening. If you look at the coastal part of Mozambique, there was interaction with the Sultan of Oman, and a lot of the Arab traders that would come as far south as Mozambique. So in terms of foreign interaction, it was there. But in 1652, the Dutch then decided to set up a camp. They set up a charter in what is now called the Cape. And by doing this, what they were trying to do is actually be able to service their ships that were touching on that tip of Africa as they went off to their main colonies, which was specifically Indonesia. And in Indonesia, they were getting a lot of the spices, a lot of the things that you couldn't get in Europe, and obviously making a very good buck.
So it was like it was a stopping point.
It was a stopping point for their ships. So this particular charter was to create an opportunity to farm and both crops and animals, and replenish these ships that were off to the Far East.
So what kind of people? Who are the people that they were actually trading with? The natives.
So initially, what happened is when they set up shop, they were trading with the natives. And remember, at that time, you're looking at the Khoisan group of people who are pastoralists. They're not people who are going to sit and actually farm for you. And so eventually, what happened was they realized that they can't get enough of the produce that they were looking for. So they needed them to obviously get a bit more creative. They let go of some of their workers and made them people who would then go and start farming, to own some land and be able to produce what it is that they were looking to service the ships with. And by doing that, then they needed labor because, they weren't enough Dutch people to do this kind of work. And so when they needed the labor, they then said, okay, fine, it's forced labor. You're going to be paid a very minimal amount initially. That's how it happened. And then eventually it was like, this is also not working. We now need to kind of get into some sort of formal slave engagement. And so they indentured a lot of the local communities to serve as slaves within those farms in order then to produce and to keep that consistency in that charter. So that's how they did it. And the initial guys who were actually set free were called burghers. I don't know whether I'm pronouncing that right.
Yeah.
But they were the Boers. They eventually became the Boers who settled all over South Africa and set up the commercial farming that we see now. But they initially did it with a forced labor model, and then which then shifted into the slave trade. Now, even the local slaves, again, remember, the local communities were people who weren't agrarian. So training them and getting them to do this kind of work wasn't going to be easy.
Yeah, just to interject there, I think it's an important point that you bring, because it was a total culture shock for the indigenous population.
Exactly.
Because we talk about the Khoisan, which really comprised mainly of two indigenous groups, which were the Khoikhoi and the San,
yes.
the Khoisan. And they were mainly, especially the San, they were pastoralists.
Yes.
And they used to move from place to place.
They
were migrants. They had a migrant kind of culture.
Yeah.
They were not acquisitive. They were less acquisitive than the Khoikhoi themselves, who put a bit more of a premium on the ownership of cattle and livestock. And the Khoikhoi had a system of chieftainship.
Exactly.
And so you're very right to point that out, because the acquisitive culture that now was introduced because of the interaction that they had with the Dutch was something of a culture shock and anathema to their cultures.
Yeah, and important to note about pastoral communities, their whole entire societal fabric is based on that movement. Their life is made, even their land ownership, their idea of owning things. The concept of owning is something culturally that is not ingrained in them, because they use the resources in a kind of subsistence way, but also in a kind of moving to areas that have not been over pastured and then letting other places rest. So they don't really need or feel the need to actually own the land. But also you can imagine the freedom that then these guys had to move across the landscape, and then having to come into an environment where they're caged and having to do a certain type of job. That was really not part of their culture. And in fact, if you look at that, within 50 years, those communities were literally just destroyed because of that. So it's an important thing to note that then the Dutch struggled with this type of labor, and in fact actually sourced slaves from other places. We actually have slaves that landed about 4 or 5 years later from Ghana. And I think there are some records that show quite a number. They were dispatched about 200, I think only 170 arrived. So that tells you about the wastage in terms of shipping some of these guys across the Atlantic. But so these guys were brought and forced onto this colony, and then they could do a lot of that agrarian type of work because they were not, similar to the Khoisan pastoralists, and they were used to the idea of being slaves anyway. So you had the Ghanaians come in, you had slaves that would come even from the Far East, because remember, in Holland itself you couldn't own slaves. So for the people who were working in the Dutch Indonesian colonies, if they owned slaves and they were going home, and was a natural stopping point. At this point is where they would sell those slaves
because they couldn't take them back home.
So then you had this accumulation of slaves, and eventually you actually had a ratio of 3 to 1. So there were more slaves, in this colony than there were Dutch.
Now I'm going to throw a bit of a grenade into the conversation.
Oh, please do.
Because I remember watching something, I think it was on YouTube, from a revisionist South African historian.
Yeah.
Who, this term revisionist has kind of negative connotations because somehow it seems to imply that because you're going against the grain, the information might not be too accurate. But something very interesting I heard from this guy, and really, I should have his name, but maybe we'll put it in the show notes, or somebody, like we say, this is a conversation, and in traditional African spirit, you can contribute and put it in the comments. But this guy says that the Khoisan were actually much more advanced than the historians, the official historians, give them credit for, because he says that they were actually dealing in gold coinage.
Oh yeah.
And part of the reason why the Dutch actually came was to find the source of this gold coinage. So he says that the historical records to prove, especially from naval records, that the Khoisan were much more advanced than many historians give them credit for. They were growing marijuana, and they were also dealing in terms of exchange and barter, not just in the traditional African sense where we think that people were just exchanging cattle and stuff, but they were actually dealing in gold coinage from a place in modern day Zimbabwe called Mutapa.
Yeah.
And so the Dutch actually got wind of this, and
decided to set up the charter. Yeah, and that's a good point, because servicing the ships was but one. And we know that eventually they stayed forever. So obviously the natural resources as well. And remember, Africa again was not this blank place where nothing was happening and people were just moving around with their cattle. There was actually a lot of metal work that Africans were engaged in. And if the local metal was gold, it was gold. I mean, it could be found and panned and produced. So that was there. So perhaps that's, I think, an interesting thing. We probably need to follow it up and see whether we could tell the story from that perspective.
Yeah, remember guys, if you have any further information on that aspect of the story, please comment below and inform us as well.
Exactly. And I seem to remember there's a movie I watched many years ago when I was a child about how they discovered diamonds in Namibia, and you had all these Dutch guys moving over there, and Germans coming in, all sorts of nationalities coming to pan diamonds and all these natural resources. So for sure, one of the things is we shouldn't be blinded by the fact that the Europeans knew there were quite a bit of resources on this continent.
Actually, the book, sorry to cut you off, but the book King Solomon's Mines was actually based on that part of Southern Africa.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So perhaps, that was the stuff they never tell you, that they'd come here because they knew there were natural resources, were probably even a lot more than what they were getting from Indonesia.
Exactly.
Because the Indonesia was just the spices, but this was gold. And, just remember, a lot of the exchange was gold backed. In those days. So if you owned that gold, you actually were very much stronger in terms of the mercantile trade that was happening around those years. Yeah,
that's a brilliant point also, because in those days the world economy was based on gold currency and the gold standard.
And the gold standard, yes.
And the major imperialists of the time, specifically, namely the British, who we will come to later on in our discussion, the British pound, the sterling, was a gold-backed
currency.
Yeah.
So you can see why it's important to own the source of gold. And perhaps the Dutch had caught on to this and decided to settle there. But yeah, so you had this colony of slaves, and there's this whole process of servicing the ships that are coming through. But of course, now this colony becomes more and more permanent as time moves on. And of course, with an expanding slave population that is mostly doing a lot of the work. And in here is where, you know, there's the human interaction between slave and owner. And we now know that there was a lot of integration happening with some of these slaves, and that's why you have all these different, what I call racial gradients in South Africa, where you know, you'll have people who have, you know, a lot of white blood in them, despite the fact that they show up today as black.
In fact, I think they even term it the Cape Colours.
The Cape Colours,
which is kind of opposite, because we're talking about the colony being set up in the Cape, on Table Mountain.
Yes.
So they actually officially called them the Cape Colours.
The Cape Colours, and these are people who intermingled. And by the way, there were also other slaves coming in from places like Madagascar. So you really had a melting pot of races that were happening. You know, that the idea of the rainbow nation, I think, really kind of is well represented by that colony that started off there. And so as time progressed with this colony, what happened is that the slave trade was finally banned, and so you couldn't have the incoming or the influx of slaves. And to keep the colony running, one of the things they needed to do was change the way they treated the slaves. Before, it was a lot easier for you to get a slave, so you didn't have to treat them well, you didn't have to feed them well, you could use a lot of violence. But now you have to kind of cut back on the violence, be a bit kinder, because where are you actually going to get more slaves?
Exactly. And I think also it's crucial to mention the fact that the reason why the slave trade was abolished eventually was because the British took hold of the Cape Colony.
Of the Cape Colony.
Especially, this was just after the Napoleonic Wars, because the British were afraid that the French would take possession of the Cape Colony, which became a valuable asset. And so they took it from the Dutch, who were allied to the French during the Napoleonic Wars.
Yeah.
And so, being under British stewardship,
the slave trade had to end.
And it ended in 1807.
And it ended in 1807.
Yeah.
So from around that time is when you start to see a better treatment of slaves. Because remember, the local communities were not predisposed to actually coming to do a lot of this labor.
Yeah.
And they weren't, and so they weren't actually, you know, able to feed the labor requirements of that time. But the most interesting thing is that at one point, actually, they developed a colony of free slaves, you know, slaves that actually ran away, because now they had the opportunity to.
So our own Southern Maroons, the Maroons we had in Jamaica.
Exactly. So our own Maroons were who were hidden in those, Table Mountain itself.
There are very many cliffs and
those
caves.
Cliffs and caves, and that's where this free community of slaves that was very vibrant actually developed. And you couldn't approach them from the rock side or the ocean side, but if you had to approach them from the entry of the cave side, they could defend themselves. And so out of that started to develop the idea that, by the way, we can be free. And so when we start to look at the desire for the Dutch to hold on, was because earlier on, even with the slaves that they had, you had this community of free people that were then driving the idea that slaves could be free, which is not a very good idea, especially if you must maintain that control.
Brilliantly put. And also, I think it's a good thing to mention, like, the difference in terms of the social aspects of, say, the British and the Dutch. Because the Dutch, they were known as trek-boers, and a lot of them were pastoralists.
Yeah.
And they had a similar lifestyle, ironically, to a lot of the people that they would eventually come into contact with, the Khoisan. So we have this kind of idea, or this notion that is put in our heads, especially when it comes to discussing colonialism, that anybody white who comes into these sacred shores of ours is an imperialist capitalist with the bottom dollar as the line. Now, granted, of course, they came there to start a new life and to make a go of it in terms of monetary gain. But their lifestyles were very similar to the people
they took over.
The natives,
the
indigenous population.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this is why I think there's a whole show that must go into looking at that human interaction, even as colonialism or the takeover of Africa was happening. people to people, there was some sort of communication happening. And with the Dutch, I guess the boundaries were not as precise as what the British had wanted them to be. And indeed, when the British took over, then that's when you had that very kind of strong segregation and the beginning of what we now understand as apartheid.
Yeah.
The idea that races must stay apart, and each must also play a role.
Yeah.
Because, you know, again, back to the whole gradient of racism, which is the blacks are the stronger ones, they should do the hard labor, and then you have another bunch of guys who are going to do slightly more skilled labor.
The more cerebral kind of stuff.
The more cerebral type of stuff. And if you look at the South African community today, you know, there's a little bit of that still kind of pervades in the way white people see race.
Yeah.
And I think we'll cover that as we look at the psychology of racism in white people.
Yeah, so to kind of round it up, so we can see the Dutch come to Table Mountain in 1652. They start dealing with the Khoisan and trading for cattle and sheep. They set base.
Yeah.
They start making a life for themselves. They're known as trek boers because they have a nomadic pastoralist kind of lifestyle.
And they're extending out of the Cape.
And they're extending out of the Cape and moving outwards. The British come in, take over the Cape Colony, and this is around 1806 actually. The following year, the slave trade is abolished, which puts a span in the work to many of the Boers who depended on that kind of indentured labor or slavery, you know, to make their way in life. And so what you see happening over a period of time is the Boers start migrating further inland.
Yeah.
And what you find in South Africa is that the land becomes more fertile and more conducive to kind of an agrarian subsistence lifestyle.
The
more north and east you go, there's more rainfall, there are more rivers.
Yes.
So these people, and also because of the disaffection that they had with these new anti-slavery policies, a lot of the Boers start migrating north and start trying to find their way north. And the thing to mention about the Boers is they're very Calvinistic in their outlook.
Yeah.
So, you know, the Boers really, they're a mixture of the Dutch, mainly the Dutch, but there are also some French Huguenots in there and some Germans. And they had a very Calvinistic biblical outlook on life, which made them believe that they were the chosen people. And so there was this kind of thinking.
White supremacy.
Kind of white supremacy. Well, and in biblical terms, they saw that, like when they came across the plains of Natal, they believed that God had actually ordained them with that land. And so they had a sense of entitlement.
Yeah.
And so as they further moved inland, they became known as the Voortrekkers, which meant they were the pioneers. They were seen as the pioneers because it was a very difficult journey for them because you know, those hinterlands mainly were unexplored by white people. I hate it when they say discovered because the Africans were there from before. But it was a very long and arduous journey for them. They came into a lot of conflict with especially a lot of the Bantu tribes. Now, we haven't really mentioned the Bantus because they migrated over long periods of time from about the 1100s from Central Africa and the Great Lakes region. A lot of them also came over from the west coast, from the Angolan region. And so they came into conflict, a lot of conflict with the Voortrekkers. And the Bantus mainly consisted of, the names escape me now.
The Zulus.
But the Zulus, but the two main sub-tribes were the Sotho-Swani and the Nguni.
Ngunis,
And the Zulus that Edge mentions are part of the Nguni tribe.
Yes.
So they come into contact with the Zulus. And there's a lot of conflict.
There's a lot of conflict there. Yeah. Definitely. And I mean, sometimes I wonder, because again, even as you look at rewriting this history, how much interaction the Bantus had with foreigners. Yeah. And perhaps that's what gave them, again, the courage to say no. Yeah. So I wonder whether that's written somewhere, and I'd like to hear somebody who can, you know, help us find information around that. Yeah. Because I think that exposure created that much more resistance in Bantus that wasn't there with the Khoisan, for example. I think because of their pastoralism, were still free to do what they wanted to do in their own land, and they never really needed to trade with a lot of these external forces. Yeah. But the Bantus, through their movements around Africa, had actually been in contact with a lot of these people who were coming in and coming out, the Dutch, the Portuguese, the Arabs. So they had experience of being taken over or being forced, or they even had experience of the slave trade. you know, people coming in and taking young people onto boats and off they go.
Yeah.
So that resistance, I think, sometimes came from that experience. I'd like to get more information on that.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
And now, when it comes to the Bantus, populated that region of Southern Africa, we have the Nguni, the Sotho-Tswana, and the Xhosa. My South African friends, or my Southern African friends will, is it the Xhosa? The Xhosa. Anyway, sorry for butchering.
You have, that click,
I tried. At least I get points for trying.
Yeah, you
but
get
anyway,
points for trying.
So we had the Xhosa were the southernmost, I believe. They were agro-pastoralists, and they also frequently came into contact and into conflict with the Voortrekkers, or the Boers, who they called them the pioneers.
Yes.
But the Nguni were more in the eastern plains, or in the eastern coastal region, and the Sotho-Tswana were more in the eastern highlands.
Yes, yes.
And there was also a lot of social upheaval at that time between the Bantu tribes because of something that has come to be known as the Mfekane, which translates to the crushing or the scattering. Historians over the years have debated as to why this actually came about. Many people primarily blame drought and hunger for the mass migrations that were taking place at that time. Also, there was also the aspect of internal slave trade. So you had slave traders of Arab, Swahili origin, and the Portuguese, who were coming inland to snatch slaves and take them over to the Mozambican coast, where they could be traded as chattel to other regions of the world. So this Mfekane also brought about a lot of social upheaval and upset the social structures of that area. And what happened?
And wasn't it always the case? I think if you look at East Africa, we had a similar thing.
Yes.
Where by the time the British were coming to settle, they kind of found nobody on the land. But it's because there'd been some sort of migrations and scattering that was happening because of drought. And so you're right, these seasons were an opportune time as well for the takeover of land and for, you know, more exploration, if you like, of these foreign communities inland to make way, because then, you know, to them, I guess, there's nobody there.
Yeah, and they kind of took advantage of all the social upheaval that was going on.
Yeah.
And so what you see happening, especially with the Nguni tribe, is that there was a lot of consolidation, and the tribes and the polities that existed around that area became larger because those kingdoms and those kings who could offer security and patronage
people around them.
Gathered more and more people, which brings us round neatly to the story of the Zulus, who are now the most populous tribe in South Africa.
Yeah.
And a lot of that can be attributed to the reign of Shaka Zulu.
Yes.
And Shaka was a king who has been, in my opinion, very wrongly vilified.
Misrepresented
by historians. Because, you know, one man's Napoleon is another man's bloodthirsty tyrant, which is how they've kind of painted him, because he was African. But he was actually a brilliant military mind. And he was also a very brilliant political man, because he actually came into contact with a lot of the British, who are now just starting to come into that area of Southern Africa. But basically, Shaka amalgamated, usually by force, you know, not to paint him as this kind of benevolent kind of figure.
Dictator.
But he consolidated a lot of the Nguni to form the Zulu tribe that we know today. A lot of it was done by force. And the Zulu army, which was known as the Impi, became a formidable fighting force amongst those peoples in that region of Southern Africa.
You know, just as you're saying that, I'm just, you know, thinking about two things that really we kind of just need to keep touching on. Is the idea that history is going to be written from a perspective of Shaka Zulu being a tyrant. And why is that? Is because I think the British had realized these guys are actually very strong people and strong resistors. And how do you weaken them? You kill any history of them ever having been strong and ever having been, you know, righteous, even in their intent. You create a feeling that this is tyranny and what he was doing was actually a bad thing. So you rewrite history negatively. And that's really why this, I think, podcast is so important, that we need to kind of, as Africans, begin to gather this information from all sorts of people to come together and help to revise and rewrite some of these things so that we have the right position about the leaders, the kingdoms, the cultures that we had before the white man came in. So that's a very important point. But the second point is that if you have a lot of people coming in to take slaves out for their labor force in this capitalist system, then it then falls also to reason that as Shaka he would want to amalgamate these people who are anyway going to be taken out to be slaves in order to build a formidable force and an army that's going to stand against these foreign invasions. And so in a way, just the fact that he's being painted as a tyrant removes the idea that African leaders had strong military strategy, had foresight, could foresee a lot of the things that were going to come and damage their societies and were actually taking action. And now you can continue to paint them as victims rather than, you know, the idea that Africans were just kind of taken over and they were just sitting there doing nothing. But this story has had to be rewritten so that Africans believe they have nothing. They were just victims. They were just kind of swamped over by this invasion of white people, which is not the case. You had thinkers, you had people who were thinking ahead, you had strategists, you had people who had foreseen that this invasion would bring huge cultural changes that were not going to be for the benefit of their community.
And it also weakens the political aspect of it, because these are people who had a lot of political acumen.
Yeah.
Because the way that, just carrying on a little bit about Shaka, and I think it's important that we kind of touch base with Shaka and maybe park the bus there a little bit, because he is so well known.
Yes.
He's one of the most well known, especially in the African diaspora.
Yeah.
The story of Shaka has been bastardized, you know, over time, to kind of paint him as this kind of African savage who was bloodthirsty, because his whole story was that he was rejected by his father, who was the Zulu king, and he was a bastard child. And so,
was there ever a bastard child in African culture? Even that we should question.
Even that should be questioned.
Because there is nothing like a bastard child. Every child is a gift and a blessing to the society that child comes into.
Yes.
And every society and community had a way of incorporating these children. Whether that meant it's the grandfather who then take ownership of this child, or it is an uncle that will take ownership of this child. A child always had a place, because, and especially a boy child. Why? Because this is the future army. These are the people that you need to protect your community and further it. So why would there be even a bastard?
Exactly.
Idea of a bastard child.
You see,
very European concept.
I was just going to say
the imperialists, they had these kids outside of marriage.
Yes.
And the whole idea of bastards out there.
Yeah. So that was the contention, because the way he's painted is that his father, I believe his father's name was Senzanakona.
Yeah.
Had him out of wedlock before it was, you know, the union was formally recognized within the kraal, the kraal.
Yes, yes.
Those kind of in the Zulu kingdom, and this is before the Zulus became the Zulus, the large Zulus, because of Shaka. And so historians have tried to paint Shaka in this kind of light as his whole reign was this kind of bloodthirsty, vengeful kind of mission to get back at his father for being rejected to his rightful, you know, position as heir to the throne of the Zulus. But where, you know, the truth is actually much deeper than that.
He's an illegitimate child. He's then also an illegitimate leader.
Yeah.
He's therefore illegitimate as an African thinker. As
by European standards.
By European standards.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like zero rating any sort of strength or power that
exactly. And you will never see in the history books the fact that Shaka actually protected a lot of his people from European incursions and invasions. They just painted as the fact that he came, he consolidated the Nguni, a lot of the Nguni tribes and the polities into one huge fighting force that became very bloodthirsty. Totally negating the fact that he came up with military strategies that I was going to say to this day, but for very many years, they used to call them the buffalo horns, where they would attack the enemy from the wings. The fastest infantrymen would attack from the wings and you know, surround the enemy and then attack. And that was the style of warfare that was used for many years after that. I believe, was it the famous Battle of Isandlwana where they defeated the British?
Exactly.
Those were the tactics that were actually used. And so they kind of attenuate his military brilliance and his political acumen. But Shaka came to his downfall because of his treacherous half-brother called Kingane. And So the story of the Zulus, I really implore people, like the guys who are watching and listening to this, to research more into his story, because it is very compelling and it sets the narrative for a person and a people, namely the Zulus, who are very proud of their heritage and their culture, and rightly so. Because their story has been bastardized and misrepresented.
And if you have information you can share with us, you know, about how we can begin to revise this because we do need to rewrite our story, we do need to own our story, so that, you know, our future generations also have a view that, you know, we weren't just victims. And the victim mentality, and I'm sure we're going to talk about it as we move to other topics in the course of time, is Africans almost had no history. It's like a blank sheet of paper until the British came, or until the Dutch came. So we do need people who can share any information they have, so that we're able not just to fill up those gaps, but to also create that identity and that self-esteem that comes with that.
So, like, now we push the story a bit more forward. The Voortrekkers have gone inland. They've established colonies. Mainly, a lot of them were trying to get away from the British sphere of influence, because let's not forget. And
funny enough, this kind of is an interesting thought for me, which is that, you know, back to this idea that not all Europeans were equal.
Yes, that is very true.
And it's true. And you know, we talk about it, I think, in later stages when we're looking at the independence struggles, the realization that not all Europeans are equal.
Some were more equal than others.
Some were more equal than others. And that they all also brought a very different texture. The British brought a very different way of operating, that was very different from the way the Dutch operated. So that's an interesting point, that you created a slave colony and now you're also having to run away from the influence of the incoming power.
So we will come to that actually. You've set the stage very well. So now, these Voortrekkers, the Boers, the pioneers, they've come inland, they're trying to get away from the British sphere of influence, who have abolished slavery in 1807. Formally, they actually abolished slavery in around 1834 in Southern Africa. And they had this 4-year grace period. I forgot what the historical name that they gave it was. Kind of to wean themselves out of that whole process of slavery. But you had a lot of indentured slaves, and as you rightly said, a lot of the Boer slave owners and the white slave owners knew that they had to treat their slaves a bit better, because they were at a premium. They couldn't just go and, you know, mistreat them, they die, and you ship more from wherever, from, you know, the Indian Ocean rim, or from, you know, the Indonesian section. You actually had to treat them better. But a lot of the Boers were now moving inland to, as we say, go away from that British sphere of influence. And in 1852, they established the Orange Free State Colony. And 2 years after that, they established the Transvaal Colony, which the British allowed them to be self-governing. Or was it the other way around? 1852 Transvaal and 1854 Orange Free State. You can tell us anyway in the comments below. So they've established themselves. They believe that they are semi-autonomous, although those colonies themselves were under Boer control. The Transvaal and the Orange Free State, which were named after 2 rivers, I believe. But increasingly, more and more, the indigenous population are coming under the influence of those 4 main colonies. Orange Free State, Transvaal, which is under the auspices or the rulership of the Boers, and Natal and the Cape Colony, which is under the British sphere of influence. So what happens is, as the Boers are settling in and trying to make a life of themselves in Southern Africa, they don't have the whole slavery aspect to fall back on to build their colonies. They're still using a lot of indentured labor. As time goes on, as they become more entrenched, what happens in the 1880s, specifically in 1886, they discover gold in Transvaal, in an area called, later they'll call it Witwatersrand, which I believe means white water found on the Long Reach. And obviously, as soon as gold is discovered, that was the beginning of the end, because the British eyes, all of a sudden, like spotlights.
We got the gold!
So all of a sudden, the Boers discovered that there's gold in Witwatersrand, in Transvaal, in 1886. And lo and behold, the British decide that these guys are not as democratic as they need to be. Like, hey, you know what, you guys, you Boers, man, you're not really democratic. I think we need to come and impose some democracy in this region.
The usual narrative.
So they had lived freely and relatively, autonomously.
Yes.
The Boers I'm talking about, away from British influence, until they discovered gold. And I think the premier at that time was a man by the name of Paul Kruger.
Yes.
And so what happens is they discover this gold. All of a sudden the British take interest and start agitating and saying, you know what, you Boers, because the Boers had not given any political rights to the settlers who had come in.
Yeah.
I believe they called them Uitlanders in Dutch or in Afrikaans, what
Yes.
later became known as Afrikaans, which were the British settlers.
Yes.
And they didn't give any civil rights at all to the natives, which didn't seem to, it hadn't really bothered the British prior to the discovery of gold, which is kind of funny. But so
Yes.
the British now decided that, hey, you guys, you're not very equitable in your dispensation of power.
Exactly.
You need to come in here. Enter a character by the name of Cecil John Rhodes, who is this kind of eminence Greece kind of character, who's kind of very kind of nebulous in the annals of the history books.
Yeah.
And
a lot of
British South
unknowns
Africa.
about him.
A lot of unknowns about him. He sets up the British South Africa Company. Is that the full name? The British South African Company. Anyway, it's a company that he sets up. He's described in the history books as a miner and a prospector of gold. But his story is very, very mucky. And so the British South Africa Company, we've touched on it when we talked about East Africa and West Africa. This whole rule by corporation and the charters.
Yeah.
And how, because these are limited...
At the Majesty's service.
At Her Majesty's service. And because these are limited liability companies, they cannot really be blamed for
any
loss of life or atrocities
Yeah.
while they're carrying out, the goals of the charter. So I don't know, Edge, if you have this quote. I think it's a very telling quote given by Cecil John Rhodes at the age of 23.
At the age of 23, this is what he said, which is rather striking. He says that why should we not form a secret society with but one object, the furtherance of a British Empire and the bringing of a whole world under British rule, for the recovery of the United States, for making the Anglo-Saxon race but one empire. And that's from his book Confessions of Faith.
Yeah. Written when he was 23 years old. 23
so
years
interesting, a British Empire and a takeover of the whole world.
Yeah.
And the gold was really the whole world, because remember, you have a whole economy that's still gold-backed. This is where your supremacy lies in terms of controlling the global economy for years to come. Yeah. So
these are the characters that British imperialist forces were using or had at their disposal in order to carry out their imperialist aims. Cecil John Rhodes enters stage left into the fray. Paul Kruger, who was the leader of the Boers at that time, becomes kind of attacked from all angles because of the fact that the British say that these Boers are not really very equitable in the dispensation of power.
And we need to have a piece of the pie.
We need to have a piece of the pie, because now gold, as we have mentioned before, was kind of like this, the staple of the world, of world economy, and the British sterling pound was based on the gold standard. So this kind of, we start seeing kind of the I was going to say the green shoots. It's not really appropriate when you're discussing the build up to
the
tentacles
war.
Tentacles, that's a much better word. So the tentacles of war
begin
to spread out of this, namely the discovery of gold in Transvaal, and the British using the British using this excuse of inequity and iniquity maybe in Southern Africa. So there's a whole build-up of tensions. Keep in mind also at this time the Boer kind of administration in that part of the world is becoming bankrupt, because they were trying to build a railway from modern-day Pretoria to Cabo Delgado in Mozambique, because they had no outlet to ship out their to the
and
port
now
to
with
ship
the
out their
Cape,
exactly.
Not under their control.
Yeah, which now would become much more crucial with this discovery. So what happens is the British start agitating for a war. The Boers start holding their ground. And of course, we're not trying to paint the Boers as the saints in this. Keep in mind, they still really wanted to keep hegemony over the region. Yeah. They still did not want to give any civil rights to the indigenous population. The settlers, the British settlers, had no political rights. So the Boers now give an ultimatum to the British to say, listen, you guys have to, this is a provocation.
Yeah.
You keep sending your ships and sending these military forces to our region. They gave them an ultimatum to say you have to leave by this certain amount of time. The British once again fell back on the excuses like, no, you guys, democracy, and all the while knowing that their long
shortest
snouts, their long snouts was just smelling that gold.
And I mean, it's so interesting for me that these are two foreigners, literally. Yeah. Albeit the fact that the Voortrekkers had been there by now for about 200 years, notwithstanding. But I mean, there is actually no discussion about what the local person is entitled to. In fact, at this point, they have no rights. I mean, people just literally come into your country, they find what it is they want, and then proceed to disengage you and to kind of put you aside and take away your rights.
Yeah.
And right now, the discussion is between the rights of two white communities.
Yes.
I mean, that's really just thinking about that makes you wonder, I wish I was there just to see how these people thought, what was going through their mind when you just walk into somebody's country.
Say,
and now I want that, and you, the local person, stand aside.
Oh, you're here, exactly.
Yeah, amazing.
So it's amazing. It's amazing, but really not shocking.
It's not shocking.
Sadly. So now
sometimes that I think needs to sink in.
It does need to sink in.
Yeah.
So now we have as Edge brilliantly described, these tentacles of war beginning to creep up. Into the whole setup. And so what happens is the Boers now gave the British an ultimatum and say you need to leave by this certain period of time. And the British took that as a declaration of war. And we had mentioned Cecil John Rhodes. Actually, we should end off with him by saying he actually came up with this idea to overthrow the Boer government at the time.
Yes.
With something that was famously now known as the Jameson Raid, because Jameson was a friend of his who he instigated to try and take over this coup a couple of years before the Boer War actually started.
Yeah.
And it was a miserable failure. It was an embarrassing failure actually, because they preemptively went and tried to take over or to overthrow the government. It was
it wasn't
total. It wasn't well organized. It failed. That actually led to Cecil John Rhodes' name being totally tarnished, and actually led to him going out of the public consciousness and the public eye because he was so embarrassed by that failure. So what happens is the Boer War now kicks off in 1899. It's primarily just a battle for the gold reserves in South Africa, because that was the biggest gold rush in history. People talk about the one in California. This one was much bigger.
Oh yeah.
Because now we start setting the stage to actually what came about in South Africa afterwards. And not just South Africa, Southern Africa.
Southern Africa. Yeah, and I think it's important to mention that that region has a lot of natural resources, including diamonds, including coal. So what was happening in South Africa, what is the country now called South Africa, was really going to impact the frontline states and how their economies were going to evolve with this really strong superpower controlling a lot of the gold. Then going out there and taking over these economies or driving those economies in the way that it wanted. So remember, and I think this is in a bit of the future, I think that the white communities of South Africa wanted to create a buffer between themselves and other African states in East Africa, the DRC, and create a kind of frontier of states that are friendly. And so a lot of those Voortrekkers would have gone into the Namibias, into the neighboring states, and actually taken over to create that frontier and that security. Yeah. So this then, then rides out into the present day in terms of how those economies operate and how they are governed.
Yeah, and that sets the stage. What I just talked about there, it sets the stage brilliantly, because the reason now we concentrate and start with South Africa is because South Africa now is the template and sets kind of the way things were going to develop for the rest of the other Southern African regions. Exactly. Because of migrant labor, because of the discovery of gold. Yeah. And diamonds as well.
Diamonds as well.
This is how the De Beer Company came about.
And even the freedom struggles, I think, you had a lot of interference in some of those countries.
Yes.
By the South Africans, in terms of how those nations became free. And if you look at relative to the rest of Africa, I think we say again, independence, or I don't know, self-determination was like a wave, with West Africa kind of starting, and then you had East Africa. And then having the Southern African were the last ones. You had Zimbabwe kind of coming into the fray in 1980. Imagine that, 1980.
Southern Rhodesia.
Yeah, Southern Rhodesia. And you'd had places like Kenya where the independence had been there since 1963. So again, really looking at the power of this natural resource and how much the white community wanted to hold on to some of these countries and interfere to create that security buffer.
Definitely. And this really goes to the heart of the reason why South Africa became the economic power of Africa, because it had access to all that migrant labor, to a labor force that was disenfranchised, maltreated, poorly paid, from not just their own country, but from the whole subcontinent of Southern Africa.
Yeah, so contrary to popular belief.
Exactly.
I think, sometimes we say South Africa is so advanced because they're smart.
And because they have white rulership.
And they have white rulership.
Total nonsense.
No, they have the resources.
They have the resources.
And they can trade globally very differently.
Yeah.
I think South Africa is the only country that sits at very high levels in the global organizations that control oil, that control the United Nations. They're seen very differently because of the fact that they control these resources.
Yeah.
And even when you look at things like during the apartheid regime, the idea that some nations were telling their citizens, we're not going to trade with these guys. We've put sanctions on these guys because of apartheid. That's not true. There was still a lot of diamonds that were moving across the globe with De Beers and all. So really, at the end of the day, those natural resources determined the history and the destinies of the people of that region.
Economically, sociologically, politically, exactly. So that sets the stage as to how South Africa became the dominant economic force, not just in Southern Africa, but in many ways in Africa.
In Africa, yeah.
So we have the Boer War, 1899 to 1902. Many historians have termed this the first modern war. It's the first war where you see the use of concentration camps.
Yes.
It's the war where a lot of the outdated kind of military tactics that were used in the 18th century and the 19th century were still used, and many people saw them as outdated. Or virtually all the fighters actually were volunteers. And so this is the first war that actually made people and those imperialist powers think that conscription should be the way forward, because a lot of them were not suited to that kind of warfare.
Yeah.
I believe Mahatma Gandhi was also a volunteer in that war as a stretcher bearer. Somebody who maybe can confirm that, who knows. I'm not trying to cast any aspersions.
That's another whole podcast.
That's another whole podcast.
That's another whole podcast.
So the Boer War was very interesting because initially the Boers had the upper hand.
Yeah.
And they won battle after battle. But was inevitable over time because of the superior resources and manpower that the British could call upon. Eventually the British now gained the upper hand in the Boer War. And they won. And not before that, the Boers actually turned it into a guerrilla warfare, which made it prolong the war slightly longer, but which actually made the British now introduce this concept of concentration camps to stop the indigenous Boer populations from, launching these skirmishes from their various centers, because obviously they knew the lay of the land much better than their adversaries.
And if anybody understands the idea of these concentration camps, they were kind of shifted and changed over time. If you look at all the wars, like you go into the Korean War, you go into the Vietnam War. There was the idea of concentrating people in villages.
Yeah.
It wasn't very far from that. And so as you say that it's the modern war, you begin to see a lot of that, those kinds of tools being used to stop this kind of guerrilla type warfare.
Yes.
You control the movement, you cordon off and keep in one place so that you can keep an eye and control what people are doing, saying, and how information is being exchanged.
Exactly.
Because a guerrilla, yeah, so I was just kind of wanting to talk about guerrilla warfare. Around how, you know, this particular war was a modern war. And when you're dealing with any kind of war that, you know, is community-based, is guerrilla-type warfare, what you want to do is have people enclosed so that you can actually see them, you can control their movements, because really those wars are about how information is being passed between the people, the warring, the opposing team, how food is being passed around, and most importantly, the surprise element. Because guerrilla warfare is just about that. It's about using the community to do those surprise attacks that then win the war, because they are sporadic, they are surprises, and they are actually very well coordinated through the information that flows out of these areas. So those concentration camps were part and parcel of what was even used later in all these other wars, like the Vietnamese War, the Korean War.
Famously in the Second World War.
Yeah, famously in the Second World War, cordon people off, have a gate, control their movements, and control the inflow and outflow of information and food. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's where we are. The Boer War, eventually, through the superior resources that the British had and sheer force of numbers, they won, which means that they were the ones who were now able to set the terms for the peace. So the Boers had to come to the negotiating table. What eventually ended up happening was that the British now gave the white population, the Boers, a degree of autonomy. Yeah. So the Boer colonies, namely the Orange Free State, I always do that one. The Orange Free State and Transvaal became crown colonies under the British rule, but they became self-governing. Yeah. In terms of they were under Boer stewardship. There was a clause in terms of the negotiation of the peace where the British were saying that the indigenous population should have the same rights as the whites, but that was just nominal. And I think one of the negotiators actually came out later and said, well, that was really just in name only. In name only. In the actual nitty-gritty, in the terms of the surrender, the real political power and socio-economic power would lay with the Boers. So there you have it. You now had the setting of what would later come to be known as the Union of South Africa, which was basically an amalgamation of the four main states, which was Natal, the Cape Colony, which were the two British states initially, and Orange Free State and Transvaal. And so all that meant was, okay, it was under British dominionship. But those indigenous populations were under the thumb, basically, of the British and the Boers. Yeah. And so now this set the stage for what would later be called the South Africa Act, I believe in 1909 or 1910, maybe somebody can tell us in the comments below, which gave voting rights to white males. Only. White males, not even white females. I think the white females, the Boer females got some nominal voting rights in 1930. Yeah. The rest of the indigenous population, you know, the coloureds, the blacks, the Indians had no rights of suffrage until 1994. Exactly. So the South Africa Act came into being, which now set the stage for what we would now know later on to be known as the apartheid system. The apartheid system, yes, of segregation. Of segregation. And when you come to study this period of history, especially in South Africa, you come to realize that actually the template for apartheid South Africa was not so much set by the Boers, although they obviously played a very major role in that, but it was set by the British. Because up until that point, up until the 1880s and the discovery of gold in Transvaal, the elite in society were those landowning elites
Yes.
who are the Boers, up
Yes.
until the discovery of those minerals that made it much more economically feasible for the
Yeah.
British to be in South Africa. And what you see happening with the introduction of the British taking dominionship over that region of Southern Africa is that the Boers and the Afrikaners themselves were kind of socially engineered by the British imperialist powers.
Yes. Yes.
And you know, because of inflated land prices, because of the Boer War, they actually suffered to nowhere near as big a degree. So we're not trying to make it seem like they suffered greatly, but they were actually socially engineered because of those events and the introduction of international capital as well. And so what you'd find happening is a lot of the Afrikaners and the Boers, a lot of them became landless and started migrating to the urban areas. And the accusation was made of them that they did not really enjoy manual labor. So the Boer administrations and the British administrations made conditions more conducive for their employment. So you had things like the Mines and Workers Act of 1911, which formally introduced into legislation the colour bar, which restricted the amount of employees who are of colour or who are black or Indian. So preference had to be given to whites initially. This was partly and mainly actually to placate the Boers, and also it was a way now to industrialize the Boers, to get them into the Euro-Christian capitalist work ethic, because a lot of them had been used to that agrarian way of life, and they had been that landowning elite. So now you start seeing the tentacles, as you would say, of segregationism, because up until that point, the economic exploitation was really based upon just that, economics. The British now introduced this racial element,
which then determined how resources were going to be distributed. And as you're saying that, I wonder, and it's food for thought again, if anybody who's watching has any more information. I think there are, for me, 3 questions I continuously ask myself about how it panned out in South Africa, because the question I really ask is, had other countries not fought for independence and gained it at the time that they did, would it have meant that they would also be going through a sort of apartheid state type government? The second question I always ask is, perhaps the racial problem or question in South Africa was a bit more intense than it was in other countries. If I look at Kenya, where we are now, in terms of racial integration, you're just looking at 40-odd or 50-odd ethnic groups, and then you're looking at white people and an Asian community that came to build the rail. So the issue of races may not have been as intense in terms of integration and segregation. And so maybe that's why we didn't see that kind of very deep-seated apartheid state. Although I still believe there was a lot of making sure that there was enmity between the different ethnicities, there was enmity created between the different races, so that nobody ever comes together long enough to oust this system. But with South Africa, you really find that there was almost a very intentional, there was a very intentional process of segregating people by race. And so for me, those 2 questions always persist. Had other African countries, like in West Africa or East Africa, been under the British rule for much longer, would they have gone through the same fate? Because I think it was actually the next stage of this imperialistic takeover to now create a system that is geared to distribute resources based on who you are and what color you are. And then create the labor force that was going to be required to build this British Empire that Cecil Rhodes is actually referring to. So again, these are things that I think we need to relook at and revise, because I think the white man won't come out and say that this was a planned out thing, and that there were stages to it, and that for the countries where they needed to really hold on, that they would have gone ahead and done this kind of thing. So it would be good for us as Africans to look for information or anything that can begin to help us get more information about those intentions.
That's an excellent question. So if anybody has any ideas or opinions on that, what Ed is talking about, if the prevailing conditions were similar in Western Africa, say, with the same system of apartheid and segregation have taken hold, taken root in society.
Yeah.
Comment below, let us know what you think. If you have anything to add to the conversation, remember we're doing this in the traditional African spirit of sharing information.
Yeah.
Each one teach one. So now, we have concentrated on South Africa. So we've set a base because South Africa determines a lot of the other upcoming aspects for the rest of the countries in Southern Africa.
Yes.
So if you look at, for instance, Angola and Mozambique, the Portuguese colonies in Southern Africa, they were very dependent on the migrant labor that used to come to Southern Africa and parts of Southern Rhodesia, which later became Zimbabwe. For the migrant labor who came to mine those hundreds of small mines, gold mines, that dotted and populated South Africa. So a lot of the economies in Angola and Mozambique were dependent on mining in South Africa. Same thing with what they would call Northern Rhodesia, which later became Zambia, and Nyasaland, which later became Malawi. A lot of those countries used to send their laborers to Southern Africa. And if you look at some of the the land policies and the land distribution policies, in all of those countries in Southern Africa, they always favored the white settlers. So, for instance, I think in Southwest Africa, which later became Namibia, they had something called the police zones, which was a way for the British to placate the indigenous white population and say that, okay, you guys, I believe it was 3/5 of the land in Southwest Africa could be owned in those police zones by whites only.
Yeah.
The rest of the land, I think it was maybe 1/3. And by the way, the whites in Southwest Africa at that time made less than 1/10 of the population. The rest of the land, they used to call them reserves, which is where a lot of these migrant workers were housed.
Yeah, were housed.
And a lot of that land was not the best land at all.
Of course, it was dry, arid.
Yes.
Couldn't produce much. And you were crowded in there, so you're not actually going to be doing any sort of meaningful farming.
Yeah.
Even subsistence farming.
Yes. Same thing in Southern Rhodesia, later Zimbabwe. A lot of the best land went to the white settlers. The interesting thing about Southern Rhodesia, did I say South Zimbabwe by mistake before? Sorry, Southern Rhodesia. The interesting thing about Southern Rhodesia is that they actually had universal suffrage, so which meant anybody theoretically was able to vote. The catch was that they made the property rights. They're the ones that determined who was actually able to get the vote in suffrage. So all that meant was it was basically less than 1% of the black population were able to vote if you owned any kind of land or property.
Yeah.
And so political power went to the whites in Southern Rhodesia. What you'd find between the 1920s and the 1950s in Southern Rhodesia was that the white government was mainly in partnership with the mining companies in Southern Rhodesia, and the white opposition were mainly just taking care of white working class interests and white farmers.
Yeah. So you can see, it's interesting what you're saying. You can see the conditions that are being set for you in your home country, where you have no access to land, you have no rights, obviously. And at this point, there's no slavery. So it's really kind of cheap labor. So you are trying to make a living and eke out a living. And if that is not possible in your country, then you can see how it made sense to go back down, or to go down into South Africa, into those areas, or into the Namibias where there were those mines, and you could then begin to make some sort of money. And this, by the way, really destroyed the fabric of the communities,
the social
families.
fabric.
The social fabric of this region has really been heavily impacted in terms of that migratory labor that is always headed in one direction.
To this very day.
To this very day.
Yeah.
And these are kind of what I would almost call atrocities. Many of us are saying, we need to get reparations for slaves, for the slaves that left Africa and were taken. But there were other atrocities that were done, and they were done systematically around getting people to be separated from their families for long periods of time.
Yeah.
And then you see these guys would go and mine, and nobody's taking care of their health. By the time they are returned back to their communities, they're sick and dying.
Yeah.
So it really destroyed the social structures of this region, and that has been felt up until today.
Yeah, and what you'd see happening in a lot of these communities was that whereas previously farming and agriculture was primarily a male-dominated thing, women and children now started populating the majority of their farms.
Yes.
Because of the migrant labor that were going to mine these farms and trying to get a bit more money.
And also just to add on to that, which is the slave trade took away young people who could have produced for Africa, who could have been innovating and building Africa.
Yeah.
In this system here in Southern Africa as well, you're taking the men away from a lot of these frontline states into South Africa to build South Africa,
yeah,
at the detriment of the local economy.
Exactly, local economy. Yeah. So, if you look at the other countries briefly, if you look at Nyasaland, which became Malawi.
Yeah.
Because of the dearth of economic opportunities, and also in places like northern Rhodesia, which is modern-day Zambia, the white populace was not as prevalent as in, say, southern Rhodesia and in South Africa. So the governments there were not white-dominated to the extent that southern Rhodesia and South Africa was. So some of the things that, northern Rhodesia had this policy, I think, in between the war years, where they tried to set aside 12 million acres of prime land to try and attract white settlers, which didn't quite work because, the whole thinking was that, whites will boost the local economy. And it helped them in northern Rhodesia to a certain extent when they discovered copper, because copper became the primary source of income for the economy.
Yeah.
And I think it made up something like 90% of the economy. It still wasn't enough. Same thing in the Portuguese colonies of Angola and Mozambique.
Mm-hmm.
Portugal had this colonial policy of trying to populate their colonies with whites. In Angola, a lot of the whites who settled were illiterate landowners and peasants.
Yeah.
So, and then Angola wasn't also helped with the collapse of rubber prices in 1913. What saved Angola eventually was the discovery of diamonds, and other precious minerals.
Yeah.
So Portugal always had this policy in their colonies of trying to repopulate their colonies with white settlers.
And I think that was a colonial thing as well. Because I think we experienced it in Kenya as well.
Yeah.
Where, you're called in for land because they needed the labor.
Yeah.
The thinking labor, the technically capable labor to come in and then utilize this indentured cheap labor that's local to build what it is that they were trying to build. So again, it's a system. It's the idea here is to always remind ourselves this was intentional.
Yeah.
And there was nothing about it that was a happenstance.
Yes.
Sometimes I think history places it as there was not much happening, so Europeans happened to be around. They came and took over land because nobody was actually doing anything on it. Yeah. But it was a planned thing, and it was part of this capitalist system that we see today.
Yeah, and we can also now touch on Lesotho land, which became Lesotho, and Botswana land, which became Botswana. There was always this thought, as well as modern day Eswatini, which was then known as Swaziland. Those three protectorates were actually within the landmass of South Africa as we know it today. And there was always this perception or this belief by South Africans and the British, the Boers and the British, that eventually those three protectorates would be subsumed and emerge as part of one big South Africa, which never quite materialized, partly because of a lot of pushback from the international community, partly because of other reasons. Which,
and strong, like in the kingdom of Eswatini, I think also the idea of having a monarchy that was able to collaborate and integrate differently.
Yeah. I mean, the case of Eswatini is very, very important as well to mention. I think there was a time that the British Crown, as they do, just decided to give like 2/3 of the land to the British settlers.
Yes.
And the Swazi monarchy, or the Eswatini monarchy, eventually set up a national fund to buy back a lot of that land. I think by 1968, which is when they gained the independence. It was all bought back, or most of it was bought back.
Yeah.
So the common theme that we can see, like as we wrap up this whole Southern African narrative, setting this eventually when we talk about the independence moves, is that land distribution was a massive thing.
Yes.
From Southwest Africa, which became Namibia, all the way up to northern Rhodesia or Zambia.
Yeah.
Those Southern African states really suffered because of the colonial racist policies of the British overlords.
Yes.
And this was all kicked off, I think, in 1912 or 1913 with the Native Lands Act, which basically gave an eighth of the land to the 4 million local inhabitants, indigenous blacks in South Africa, and then gave the rest of that land, which is 7/8 of that land, which is what, 88%,
to white settlers.
To white settlers. And at that time, they only made 1.25 million of the population. Similar thing happened. They tried to do that same thing in northern Rhodesia, which is Zambia, to give away 12 million acres of land there. Similar thing happened in Southwest Africa, which is modern-day Namibia, where they gave 3/5 of the land in those police zones to the white settlers who made less than 1/10 of the population. Same thing happened in many places. Mozambique was slightly different because northern Mozambique, half of the land in northern Mozambique was given to corporate interests by the Portuguese. And so you'll come to find out later on when you talk about the independence movements that northern Mozambique became a focal point for a lot of the battles that happened with Frelimo and Samora Machel, but we'll talk about that later on. So land
was a major
Land was
issue.
major.
And the way to lock that down was through the segregation of races. And ensuring that it's actually captured somewhere in the law, that people can only occupy certain types of land depending on their race. So that's another important thing around, with Southern Africa. I think, again, we've said the integration of so many different races. I think people miss out the point that there were actually Chinese settlers. There were Indian settlers. There were Madagascans. And then, of course, the local ethnicities, at least in South Africa. So you really needed a racial policy that was going to dictate how that land was distributed.
Definitely. So you can see now how these issues of land, which are still very topical today, had their roots and had their beginnings because of the policies of the colonial and imperialist policies of the British.
I guess the question I also want to ask, and it's in no way to be unempathetic to what Africans at that time were going through. The idea that we were all sort of working in the farms of these Europeans, but then when we were left with the farms, sometimes we couldn't make that work. That we were not able to actually produce as much as the Europeans were producing. And I think those are questions we need to answer is, what did we pick up that we could use after the white man had left us in such a state? And then the other thing is perhaps the market. A lot of the European farmers had a market into their own countries in Europe or whatever it is. How do we create those markets internally? I mean, these are questions that come up for me when I look at how land is being redistributed or spoken about. So in South Africa today, there's not enough land actually in the hands of blacks, let's be honest.
Exactly.
And it's a question that stands for them. But if there is a kind of background noise or a kind of idea at the back of many people's minds that if you give it to the Africans, it's not going to
work.
It's not going to work. It's not going to be productive. I've just been, sharing with you how I've seen apparently that, the news is covering that with, Zimbabwe has had to invite white farmers back because this land apparently was not being productive. And I think this is a narrative, obviously. We need as Africans also to latch on to that and ensure that we can show the results of actually owning that land by being productive.
Very, very important questions which we will be answering, definitely, in a later series perhaps. But so now, okay, we've talked about the issues of land. And how they had their nascence kind of because of these policies of land distribution, the Natives Lands Act in 1913, the Land Apportionment Act in 1930 in Southern Rhodesia, and how that's kind of set the stage for a lot of the problems that we are still facing in that part of Africa today. But another aspect of this whole kind of the South Africa Act, the South Africa Union, was the industrialization of society and the kind of social engineering that happened. As we said, it's not just the blacks who suffered that social engineering, it's the Afrikaners as well. A lot of them had to kind of get their mindset away from that kind of agrarian lifestyle and that kind of farming lifestyle, and many of them were forced into the urban centers. But so were the blacks, and the majority of the blacks who, as we've mentioned, came under this kind of color ban. And because like Britain now predominantly was moving more into Britain. Southern Africa, all of Southern Africa was becoming more
British,
manufacture based and more British. And so I think it even came to a point where just after the war actually, the manufacturing base overtook the mining base, which is really something when you consider they had the biggest deposits of gold and diamonds in that region. But with this industrialization of society, also now you start seeing the shoots of a kind of trade unionist movement, especially amongst the indigenous population in Southern Africa.
Yes.
So you see the beginnings of, like, for instance, Mahatma Gandhi had his South African Indian Congress, or I think I've butchered that name, but actually really that is what inspired the modern day ANC. Because before they became the ANC, they were known as the South African Native National Congress.
Yes.
And a lot of the policies were influenced by Gandhi's kind of political philosophy, which was pacifist, non-interventionist, and kind of trying to do things that way. So the ANC, I think, it was first formed in 1912 as the South African Native National Congress. And if you look at their policies, they were far, far, far less radical than they would become later on, because they believed that, you know, you had to gain acceptance from the white minority by acquisition of property, by self-help, by educating yourself. They also believed that you know, you had to do things in a very non-aggressive way.
Which are noble things.
Which are noble things, and
but this system was a bit too deeply entrenched to respect those noble.
Yeah, exactly. And you know, they wanted to give a platform for Africans to air their grievances. They wanted to get rid of the problem of tribalism, which, by the way, was another aspect that the British overlords actually introduced. A number of tribes. People do not know this. When they came to classify certain races, the British overlords introduced certain tribes that did not exist prior to that. So the South African Native National Congress, actually their beginnings were very pacifistic, very influenced with this kind of Gandhian. You know, when you think about Gandhi, you think about love, light and harmony, and all this kind of thing.
Whilst still resisting.
So this is one of the kind of products of the industrialization of that society.
That's a very good point.
And it wasn't just in South Africa. You had the same kind of movements happening in Southwest Africa as well, in the beginnings, also in Angola and in Mozambique as well, and also in Northern Rhodesia, which became Zambia. You had very strong trade unionist movements, which were outlawed by law, because a lot of the wage bargaining mechanisms that were there to enable trade unions to actually thrive and flourish in an industrializing society were proscribed, and they were banned by law.
However, you know, interesting point, even up till now, the workers' rights in those countries tend to be very strong. There's very clear rules around how long somebody can work, what benefits pertain to them when they're working, what happens when they're injured. And this is very much unlike what you find in, for example, the East African environment, where a lot of things just are not governed. I think if I look at Kenya, the Employees Act of 2007 is really what entrenched the idea of actually legalizing, and then also you being able to litigate and go to court against any employer that has breached some of these things. But in those countries, because of that very strong history of trade unions, they've had these, you know, worker rights very much entrenched. It's very difficult, like in South Africa today, if you have somebody, you know, working in your house, you know, a house manager, you know, you can't keep them past 4:30. 4:30 is really the time they finish work, and that's it. Whereas in Kenya today, you know, you can keep your house manager for longer, you don't pay them overtime, and there's no law that really kind of comes comes down on that. We're trying, but this is 2020 when you're now beginning to pass a law that benefits domestic staff. So that's actually, it's a benefit. I think in a way it has worked for the people of today, that history was there.
Yeah. So we've talked about land being a big issue. We've talked about the industrialization of society. The shoots of the trade unionist movement, which became very significant in Southern Africa, and led to a lot of the independence drives later on. Important to mention also, between the interwar years, basically Nyasaland and Northern Rhodesia were just glorified hunting grounds for migrant labor, because not much else was going on economically there, and all that migration was going towards South Africa. Actually,
and
interestingly,
that still remains the case today.
And it still remains the case today. Interestingly, a lot of those workers tended to bypass Southern Rhodesia because the mines were not as lucrative in present-day Zimbabwe as they would be in Southern Africa. So they used to bypass those places. Yeah, so a lot of the workers and the migrant workers who used to move from Northern Rhodesia and Mozambique and Nyasaland used to bypass Southern Rhodesia because they were not as lucrative as the mines in South Africa.
Yes.
And the working conditions were much worse because the profit margins were much less.
Yeah.
What tended to happen, wages were suppressed, the food was not as plentiful. So they used to avoid working in the mines in Southern Rhodesia and go to maybe Witwatersrand and go straight down to South Africa. So we can now see how the whole concept of South Africa as the economic dominant powerhouse in that region and in Africa came about because of that free labor, more or less. You know?
So it's not that they were smarter or better. They had the resources, they had the free labor. It was only
from the whole subcontinent, and not just from the country, which is a vast area of land. So now we can see how we are slowly setting the stages for what would become apartheid South Africa. And apartheid existed not just in South Africa, by the way. It also existed in Namibia. What was then known as Southwest Africa.
Southwest Africa, yeah.
But basically those racial policies, whether it was apartheid or not, the racist and racial policies that governed land distribution and the like, you know, the stage was set really in South Africa. And we can see how the trade unionist movements now started to come about because of the industrialization of society in the interwar years, all that migration and the economic migration that was happening, especially from Nyasaland and Northern Rhodesia to South Africa. A lot of the economic conditions that set about a lot of the disaffection and, with this whole colonial system were being set actually started from there.
So that's interesting because in like East Africa it was the use of land that brought the pressure for people to start agitating for their freedoms. And in South Africa it's almost as if it was the pressure of this whole industrialization process, the fair working conditions that then began to make people agitate for their freedom.
So we see these burgeoning movements slowly coming to the fore. You know, we'll talk about the ANC when we start talking about the drive for independence and autonomy. Every time I say independence, it gives me a bad look. But so we can see how the stage was set with the color bars. We should actually really talk about the pencil test, which we have mentioned in prior podcasts.
Which is the test for what race you are. Whether the pencil stuck on your hair or not. So if it went straight through, you were more white, and you got privileges that were more white. But if it stuck, it meant you were black, and therefore you got the privileges or lack of.
And actually, all this came about because of the Population Registration Act of 1950, which really entrenched the racial classifications that were brought about by these colonialist imperialist powers. So you had the blacks, you had the coloreds, you had the Indians,
the Chinese as well,
and then you had the whites. And so they were much more entrenched in terms of their racial classifications for political dominance purposes, really.
And economic.
And actually, mentioning the pencil test, they brought a variation of that pencil test when there was a bit of an outcry, because initially they said that if the pencil goes straight through your hair, then you classify as white or whatever. If it doesn't, you're black. Somehow it came to be revived a bit later on that they would put a pencil in your hair, and if you shook your head and the pencil stayed, then you were black. But if you shook your head, the pencil came out, then maybe you were not black. But anyway, so
I mean, the sheer ridiculousness.
Yes, it would be funny and it would be parody if it wasn't so serious. But so you can see how now
your life is determined by this test.
Racial classification was something that was used really to control society, to divide society, and to make sure that there wasn't this groundswell of uprising and upheaval in terms of upsetting the apple cart, the imperialist apple cart. So it was very important, especially for such a vast landmass, to have people controlled in their various pockets, where it was easier for these imperialist powers to keep an eye on them. So we've set the stage, I think, pretty well. If there's anything significant that the audience feels that we've left out, comment below. In a later series, we will now talk about the drives for independence or autonomy.
The African revolutions.
And how they came about, and why they came about, and what sparked them off. So please join us next time, when we will be discussing the Caribbean and the Americas in terms of the psychology of racism. Do not worry about South Africa. We will come back to that, because it is very, very important, especially when we talk about the independence movements and the drive for autonomy and how they came about. So that will be a series in itself, where we will talk about all these drives for autonomy.
In the different Southern African countries as well.
African countries as well. So we really appreciate your company. Don't forget, links will be in the description below. We have a very, very, very important course, which we're calling Know Your Afro Purpose, which talks about everything Africa, African history, ancient and modern history, African tradition and culture. Get to know about that. Get to know your Afro purpose and what makes you African, inherently African. Even our brothers and sisters in the diaspora and in the Americas. Know Your Afro Purpose course. The description of the course will be in the links below. Also, you can find us on our various social media platforms, so Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. We even tried Pinterest, which is a weird one, but anyway, less said about that, the better. So you can find us on all these platforms. This edition of the program was sponsored by the KIPSIGIS Museum, which is located in Karen Village. Thank you so much for joining us on this discussion. Edge, asante sana.
Do you want to tell them if you have a book of the week?
I almost forgot that. Yes, actually, let's do this feature. We have This Week in History. And actually, it's very topical, because you'll see why. I won't even tell you why. So This Week in History, we have on the 22nd of September 1960, Mali achieved autonomy. I'm trying to avoid independence.
So that was in 1960, and they are back into a military government as well.
The fourth military coup they've had since independence, actually. Wow. September 24th, 1973, Guinea-Bissau achieved autonomy. September 21st, 1981, Belize achieved autonomy. Now, This Week in History also, September 25th, 1977, Steve Biko is buried after he was murdered by the security intelligence forces in South Africa. September 22nd, 1828, Shaka Zulu was murdered by his half-brother Dengane, who subsequently became the king of the Zulus. And on September 26th, 1936, Winnie Madikizela Mandela was born.
Wow.
So, and we will talk about Winnie Mandela in depth much later on, because we both feel that she has been grossly misrepresented by the annals of history. Our book of the week this week is called The Will to Die by Kan Themba. Very, very good book. I highly recommend it. It's a collection of short stories about Black Johannesburg in the 1950s. And it was banned in South Africa until 1982 or 1983. It's definitely worth checking out. So once again, guys, thanks for joining us. As I said before, check out the links in the description about our Afro Purpose course and on our various social media platforms. Join us next week or next time when we discuss the psychology of racism in the Caribbean and the Americas. Asante sana, Edge.
Thank you. See you soon.
Thanks.